That morning, while the entire staff of Callaway Group scrambled to prepare for the arrival of their new CEO, a woman in filthy, torn clothing shuffled through the front entrance and into the gleaming lobby. She looked wrong. Wrong clothes, wrong smell, wrong everything. Security moved toward her before she'd taken 5 steps. Receptionists exchanged glances. A middle manager in a pressed blazer muttered something about optics, about how today of all days they couldn't afford a scene. No one stopped to ask if she was okay. No one offered water. No one looked at her like she was a human being. Only one man did. A black single father who worked the lowest paying job in the building, who had no title, no leverage, and nothing to gain. He walked over, handed her a cup of coffee from his own break, and sat beside her like it was the most natural thing in the world. What no one in that lobby knew was that the woman in those dirty clothes was their new CEO. And the real shock hadn't even begun. If stories like this one stay with you, stories about dignity, about the courage it takes to do the right thing when no one is watching, consider subscribing to the channel. We tell one every week. Now let's get into it. Victoria Hale had a rule she never talked about in interviews. Before taking the helm of any organization, she spent one day inside it as a nobody. Not as a consultant, not as a shadow executive, as someone the building would ignore, or worse, remove. She'd done it 3 times before. Each time, it told her more about a company's real culture than 6 months of due diligence ever could. She believed, with the kind of certainty that only comes from hard experience, that an organization's character wasn't visible in its mission statement or its quarterly earnings call. It lived in the small moments, in the way a receptionist spoke to someone who couldn't do anything for her career, in the way a security guard used the half-second of power his badge gave him, in whether anyone in a crowded lobby would bother to look up. So the morning before her official introduction as the new CEO of Callaway Group, Victoria woke up at 5 a.m., put on a coat she'd bought from a Goodwill bin in a neighborhood she didn't live in, rubbed dirt along the hem, and pulled a wool hat low over her face. She left her phone, her watch, and her wallet in her hotel room. She took nothing that could identify her. She walked into Callaway Group's headquarters at 7:43 a.m. and stood in the lobby. The building was beautiful in the way that expensive things often are, cold and deliberate. All glass and polished stone, with a reception desk that looked more like the entrance to a luxury hotel than an office. A large digital display cycled through the company's values in clean sans serif font. Integrity, innovation, people first. Victoria stood near the entrance and waited to see what those words actually meant. It took 4 minutes. The first person to approach her was a security guard named Patrick. She could read his badge from where she stood. He didn't ask if she needed help. He stepped close, lowered his voice to the register people use when they want to be threatening without being overheard, and told her this was a private building and she'd need to move along. When she didn't respond immediately, he repeated it with less patience. His hand moved toward her elbow. She stepped back before he could touch her. The woman at the front desk, young, sharply dressed, a headset looped around one ear, watched the exchange with an expression of mild distaste, the way someone might look at a stain on an otherwise clean tablecloth. She didn't intervene. She turned back to her monitor. A man in a blazer who Victoria would later identify as the facility's operations manager walked through the lobby, clocked the situation in under 2 seconds, and kept walking. But not before pulling the security guard aside and saying, quietly but not quietly enough, "Just get her out of the main area. We have the new CEO coming in today. I don't want any photographs." No one asked her name. No one asked if she was cold or hungry or lost. No one looked at her face long enough to see that she was watching all of them. Marcus Reed was pushing a maintenance cart through the corridor that ran along the east side of the lobby when he saw her. He was 36 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of tired that doesn't go away after one good night of sleep. He'd been at Callaway Group for 2 years, long enough to know which managers were worth respecting and which ones just wore the title. He worked early shifts because the pay was slightly better, and because being home by 3:30 meant he could pick up his son Damon from school himself instead of relying on a neighbor who was kind but already stretched thin. That morning, before leaving the apartment, Damon had pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand at the door, a drawing, done in green crayon, of two figures standing in front of what was either a house or a hill. It was hard to tell. At the bottom, in the unsteady block letters of an 8-year-old, U.S. Marcus had folded it carefully and put it in the breast pocket of his work shirt, against his chest. He pushed the cart. He saw the woman near the entrance. He saw Patrick's posture, the receptionist's turned back, the empty space around her that everyone was maintaining on purpose. He parked his cart by the wall. He didn't calculate whether this was his business. He didn't wonder how it would look. He walked to the break room on the ground floor, poured a cup of coffee from the pot that the morning crew kept going, grabbed a wrapped granola bar from his own bag, and walked back out into the lobby. He sat down in the chair beside her, one of the low, cushioned chairs near the window that were meant to look welcoming without actually encouraging anyone to use them, and held out the coffee. "It's not great coffee," he said, "but it's hot." She looked at him. He looked back. "You don't have to go anywhere," he said simply. "Not right this second." Victoria took the cup. She didn't speak. She wasn't sure she could, not without her voice giving something away. Not emotion, exactly, but recognition. The specific recognition of someone who has spent years in rooms full of people performing decency and has just encountered the real thing. She sat with him for 11 minutes. He didn't ask her what she was doing there. He didn't make conversation to fill the silence. He finished his own coffee, stood up, nodded to her, and went back to his cart. That was it. In those 11 minutes, Victoria had watched 3 more employees walk through the lobby. 2 avoided eye contact with her entirely. 1, a young woman with an ID badge that read HR Associate, looked over, hesitated for half a step, and then continued to the elevator. She thought about what she was looking at. It would be easy, she knew, to frame this as a handful of bad actors. A security guard who was overzealous. A manager who panicked under pressure. A few employees who were simply busy, distracted, not paying attention. Easy to walk into her first week and quietly pull those individuals aside, deliver a measured corrective, and consider the matter handled. She'd seen other leaders do exactly that. Treat the symptom, protect the system, call it management. But 11 minutes in a lobby had told her something harder than that. This wasn't a few bad actors. This was a culture. It was in the speed of the guard's reaction, too practiced to be instinct, too smooth to be an exception. It was in the manager's first thought being photographs and not person. It was in the HR associate's hesitation, that half step that meant she had noticed, had felt something, and had still chosen the elevator. The only person who had not calculated, who had not hesitated, who had simply done the human thing without apparent concern for what it cost him, was a man in a gray work shirt with a maintenance cart who didn't even know he was being observed. Victoria stood up. She set the empty cup on the edge of the chair. She knew what she'd seen. She also knew that knowing the truth and doing something about it were 2 entirely different kinds of courage, and that she was not yet sure she had both. She sat still for a moment longer with the empty cup in her hands. She had walked into 4 companies this way over the course of her career, and each one had surprised her in its own direction. One had been better than she expected, small kindnesses in unexpected places, a culture that had somehow survived mediocre leadership. 2 had confirmed what she already suspected going in. But this one was different, not because of how bad it was, but because of how precisely the badness was dressed. Every person who had failed this morning had failed while looking professional. The guard had been firm, not cruel. The receptionist had been composed, not rude. The manager had been efficient, not malicious. They had all stayed perfectly within the lines of acceptable behavior, and in doing so had made the failure invisible. Invisible to themselves, invisible to anyone reviewing their conduct, invisible to anyone who hadn't been standing exactly where she had been standing and watching exactly what she had watched. That was the harder problem. It was easy to fix individuals who behaved badly. You couldn't easily fix a system that had taught an entire building full of reasonable people that the correct response to a struggling human being in their lobby was to manage her out of frame. Marcus Reed had not been taught out of that response, or if he hadn't learned it. She walked toward the service entrance, pulled out the phone she'd stashed in her coat lining, and called her assistant. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's do the official entrance." The official introduction of Victoria Hale as CEO of Callaway Group lasted 45 minutes and was, by every measurable standard, a success. She walked in through the main entrance, this time in a charcoal blazer and heels, hair pulled back, posture unhurried. And the lobby that had ignored her 2 hours earlier snapped to attention like a different room entirely. The same receptionist who had turned back to her monitor smiled broadly. Patrick, the security guard, held the door. The facilities manager in the blazer stood near the back of the assembled group with his hands clasped and his expression carefully arranged into something that resembled enthusiasm. Victoria shook hands and said the right things. She was good at this, always had been. She thanked the board, acknowledged the outgoing leadership with the precise degree of warmth that meant nothing would be read into it, and told the assembled staff that she looked forward to learning from each of them. The applause was genuine enough. Afterward, in the conference room on the 14th floor, she sat with her newly inherited executive team and listened to department heads deliver presentations they had clearly been preparing for weeks. Polished slides, curated numbers, practiced eye contact. She took notes. She asked the kind of questions that made people feel smart for answering them. She smiled at the right moments. And the entire time she was thinking about what to do with what she knew. In the days that followed, Victoria worked quietly. She requested personnel files. She reviewed the security footage from the lobby under the pretext of evaluating the building's entry protocols. She scheduled one-on-ones with department heads and used them not to introduce herself but to listen, for what people said, and more precisely for what they didn't. She identified the facility's operations manager, whose name was Greg Dalton, as the one who had made the remark about photographs. She flagged Patrick's conduct. She noted the HR associate who had hesitated at the elevator, a woman named Brianna Walsh, and made a separate note about her that was different in tone from the others. Not a red flag, something closer to a question mark. She did not tell anyone what she had actually been doing that morning. She told herself this was strategy, that going public with the story in her first week would ignite a media cycle she wasn't ready to manage, that it would put the board on the defensive, destabilize the staff, and give her enemies inside the organization, and she already knew there were some, the ammunition to paint her as a provocateur rather than a leader. She told herself that the quiet approach was more effective in the long run, that real change happened through systems, not headlines. All of this was true. She knew it was true. She also knew that it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that she was afraid of the cost, afraid that walking into her first month with a public reckoning would make her look like someone who had manufactured a crisis to establish authority, rather than inherited a broken culture and chosen to face it. She was a black woman in a CEO chair that had been occupied by white men for 23 consecutive years. She did not have the luxury of being seen as reckless. The calculus was real, and it was unfair, and it was still the calculus she had to work with. So, she stayed quiet. She moved pieces carefully. She told herself she was protecting the process. What she didn't account for was what her silence would protect instead. Greg Dalton was not an unintelligent man. He had survived 4 leadership transitions at Callaway Group by being attentive to power and careful about exposure. He didn't know exactly what had happened on the morning of Victoria's arrival. No one outside a small circle did, but he knew that something had. He'd caught the new CEO's eyes moving through the lobby during the introduction in a way that didn't match someone seeing a space for the first time. He'd noticed that her first round of one-on-ones ran longest with the people who worked the ground floor. He'd heard through the particular grapevine that middle management maintains in every large organization that someone had seen Marcus Reed sitting with a woman near the lobby entrance that morning before anyone else arrived. He put it together the way people like Greg always put things together. Not completely, but enough. He didn't confront Marcus. He was too careful for that. Instead, he began the slow, deniable process of making Marcus's position untenable. It started with scheduling. Marcus's shifts were adjusted without explanation. Earlier starts, longer gaps, the least desirable rotations. Then came the write-ups. A maintenance log filed improperly, a cleaning checklist with one item unchecked, a report of an elevator complaint that had been logged against his floor. Each incident was small. Each had just enough paper behind it to look legitimate. None of it, taken individually, would raise an alarm. Taken together, it was a wall being built around a man with no way out. Two other supervisors, reading Greg's posture the way subordinates always read the posture of people above them, adjusted accordingly. They stopped assigning Marcus to jobs that would bring him into contact with executive floors. They stopped including him in the informal conversations that happened around the time clock at shift change, the ones where information moved and alliances were quietly confirmed. A coworker who had eaten lunch with him most days suddenly found reasons to eat elsewhere. Marcus noticed all of it. He was not a man who startled easily. He had grown up in circumstances that had required him to read rooms the way other people read street signs, quickly, accurately, and while still moving. He knew what isolation looked like when it was organized. He knew the difference between a rough patch and a pattern. He kept his head down and did his work. But at night, after Damon was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table and did the math he'd been avoiding. His base pay covered rent, utilities, and groceries with a margin that he tracked to the dollar every month. Losing this job, even losing enough hours to drop below full-time status, would collapse that margin entirely. He had no family in the city. He had a neighbor, Sandra, who watched Damon in emergencies, but Sandra was 64 and her own rent had just gone up. There was no cushion. There was no plan B that didn't start with losing something Damon needed. Some nights, Damon would come padding out of his room in socked feet and stand in the kitchen doorway, not quite asleep, not quite awake. He'd say "Dad" in the soft, unspecific way that meant nothing in particular and everything at once. Marcus would put down his pencil, scoop him up, and carry him back to bed, and Damon would be asleep again before his head hit the pillow. That particular skill of childhood, the ability to fall back into rest without having to work for it. Marcus would stand at the door of his son's room for a moment after, in the dark, before going back to the table and the numbers. He thought about the woman from the lobby, the way she'd taken the coffee with both hands, like someone who hadn't expected warmth and didn't know quite how to hold it. He thought about the way the building had treated her. He thought about how none of it had surprised him at all. 3 weeks after Victoria's arrival, Marcus was called into a meeting with Greg Dalton and a woman from Human Resources he didn't recognize. They presented him with a formal performance improvement plan, a document that outlined a pattern of minor deficiencies and set a 30-day timeline for correction, with termination as the stated outcome if the targets weren't met. Marcus read the document carefully. He asked 2 questions. He signed the acknowledgement form, which was not the same as agreeing with it, and walked out. He stood in the hallway outside the HR office for a long moment. Then he went to find Victoria Hale. He didn't have access to the executive floors. He knew that. He went to the building directory, found the extension for her office, and called from a lobby phone. Her assistant answered. Marcus said his name, said he was a member of the facilities staff, and said he needed 5 minutes with Ms. Hale on a matter that he believed was directly relevant to her first week in the building. There was a pause. He was put on hold for 4 minutes. Then the assistant came back and told him to come up. Victoria's office was on the 15th floor, corner-facing, with windows that looked out over the city in 2 directions. She was standing when he came in, not behind the desk, but to the side of it, like someone who had decided before he arrived that she wasn't going to use the furniture as a barrier. She recognized him the moment she saw him. Of course she did. He recognized her too. He was quiet for a moment, processing the full shape of what that meant. Then he sat down in the chair she gestured toward, and he put the performance improvement plan on the desk between them. I'm not here to ask you to fix this for me, he said. I want to be clear about that up front. Victoria looked at the document. She didn't touch it. I know what this is, Marcus said. I've seen it before, in other places. This is what happens when someone figures out you might have talked to the wrong person and they build a paper trail so the ending looks clean. He paused. I didn't talk to anyone. I gave a woman a cup of coffee. That's the whole story. I know, Victoria said. He looked at her steadily. Then you know what's being done to me. She didn't answer immediately. He let the silence sit. The thing is, Marcus said, his voice level, I'm not surprised by Greg Dalton. I'm not surprised by any of them. People protect themselves. I've known that my whole life. What I didn't expect... He stopped, started again. I didn't expect that the person who knew the truth, who had every reason and every ability to say something, would choose not to. Victoria looked at him. I have a son, Marcus said. He's 8. I'm all he's got. He reached into the breast pocket of his work shirt and set a folded piece of paper on the desk beside the performance improvement plan, softened at the creases from weeks of being carried, the green crayon slightly faded from the heat of his chest. He drew this the morning you walked in. 2 people, a house. He wrote us at the bottom. He didn't unfold it. He just left it there, beside the official document with his name on it. This job isn't a career for me. It's the thing that keeps his life stable. He looked at her directly. You made a choice to stay quiet. I understand why. I'm not saying I don't. But I need you to understand that your silence isn't neutral. It has a direction. And right now it's pointing straight at me. The room was very still. Victoria sat down, in the chair across from him, the desk no longer between them. You're right, she said. The words landed differently than he had braced for. I told myself it was strategy, she said. That handling it quietly was smarter, more effective. I had real reasons. They weren't invented. She paused. But I also knew what I was protecting when I chose that path. And it wasn't you. Marcus was quiet for a moment. What happens now? Victoria looked at the performance improvement plan. She looked at Damon's drawing beside it. 2 crayon figures, a house or a hill, the word us in letters that didn't quite stay in a straight line. She looked at Marcus. I need a day, she said. He nodded once, picked up both pieces of paper, folded Damon's drawing carefully back along its original creases, and returned it to his breast pocket. He left without waiting for a response. Victoria sat in the empty office for a long time after he was gone. She had spent her career making hard decisions, restructurings, terminations, pivots that cost people their livelihoods and were still the right call. She understood that leadership required the ability to absorb the weight of consequences and keep moving. She had always believed that the leaders who flinched were the ones who failed. But this wasn't flinching. What Marcus had described wasn't a difficult trade-off between 2 legitimate priorities. It was simpler and more damning than that. A man had done the right thing with no audience and no agenda, and because of it, because of her silence, he was 3 weeks away from losing everything his son's life was built around. She thought about the HR associate, Brianna Walsh, who had hesitated at the elevator. That half-step. The moment where something in her had recognized what the right thing was, and she had chosen the elevator anyway. Victoria had been quietly judging that half-step for 3 weeks. She understood it now in a way she hadn't before. The half-step wasn't cowardice exactly. It was the weight of calculation, the rapid, almost unconscious accounting of what the right thing would cost, measured against what staying quiet would preserve. She had made the same calculation. She'd just had more time and more language to dress it up in. She picked up her phone and called her chief of staff. I need to schedule an all-hands, she said. Tomorrow morning, full staff, main floor, not optional. She hung up. Then she sat down at her desk and began to write out by hand everything she intended to say. Victoria didn't sleep that night. She sat at the desk in her hotel room and worked through what she was going to say until past 2 in the morning. She wrote it out in full, then cut it back, then wrote it again. Not because she didn't know what the truth was. She knew exactly what the truth was. The difficulty was in finding the form of it that didn't become a performance, that didn't turn a genuine reckoning into another carefully managed piece of her public image. That was the trap she kept circling. She was good at communication. She was good at framing. And that skill, which had served her throughout her career, was now the thing she trusted least, because she could feel it trying to take over, trying to smooth the rough edges of what she needed to say into something that would land well and protect her at the same time. The version she kept writing first was the one she had to keep throwing out. The version where she was mostly a hero who had uncovered a problem, where her 3 weeks of silence became a minor footnote, where the story was about the company's failure and not also about her own. It was a good story. It was a true story, in the way that a photograph of only part of a room is technically accurate. It would have worked. She was experienced enough to know it would have worked, and that was exactly the problem. She thought about Marcus saying, "Your silence isn't neutral." She thought about a child's drawing folded against a grown man's chest, carried through 3 weeks of quiet retaliation like something worth protecting. She put down the pen and stopped trying to write the version that protected her. The all-hands meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m. in the main atrium on the ground floor, a space large enough to hold the full staff of the building, with a low stage at one end that was usually reserved for company announcements. By 7:50, the room was full. Word had spread the way word always spreads in a large organization, fast, imprecise, and loaded with anxiety. People knew something was happening. They didn't know what. Victoria stood backstage, a narrow corridor behind the stage curtain that smelled like old coffee and electrical cabling, and looked at her notes one more time. Then she folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket. She walked out. The room settled quickly when she appeared. She stood at the front of the stage without a podium, without a presentation behind her, without anything between her and the several hundred people looking up at her from the atrium floor. She let the quiet hold for a moment. 3 weeks ago, she said, I walked into this building wearing dirty clothes and a hat pulled low over my face. I had no ID, no phone, nothing in my pockets. I looked like someone who did not belong here, and I wanted to see what would happen. The room was completely still. What happened, she continued, is that within 4 minutes a security guard was moving to remove me from the premises. The receptionist on duty looked away. A member of management walked through the lobby, assessed the situation, and his first and only concern, and I heard him say this, was that I not be visible in any photographs taken that day. She paused. In the space of 11 minutes, I watched multiple employees pass through that lobby. Not one of them stopped. She could see faces in the crowd shifting. The particular discomfort of people trying to determine whether they were being indicted or merely witnesses to someone else's indictment. There was one exception, she said. One person in this building who walked over, sat down beside me and offered me a cup of coffee. Not because he knew who I was, not because there was anything in it for him, because it was a human thing to do, and he did it without deliberation. She looked across the room. Marcus was standing near the back wall beside the maintenance corridor entrance. She had not told him to be there. He was very still. His arms were at his sides. His name is Marcus Reed, Victoria said. He works in building maintenance. He has been employed by this company for 2 years. And in the 3 weeks since that morning, he has been subjected to a coordinated and deliberate campaign of professional retaliation, shift manipulation, fabricated documentation, social isolation, orchestrated by people in this organization who correctly identified him as a risk to their own comfort. The silence in the room had changed texture. It had gone from attentive to something denser. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say coordinated and deliberate, she said. I'm not describing individual bad judgment. I'm describing a group of people who identified a threat and acted systematically to eliminate it. That is what this organization's culture produced when it was left to operate without accountability. That is what people first looks like when no one is watching. She stopped. Now I need to tell you something about myself, she said. She felt the room adjust. People who had been bracing for someone else's accountability were suddenly uncertain about the direction. "I knew about this," she said. "Not all of it. I didn't know the full extent of what was being done to Marcus until recently. But I knew that I had witnessed serious failures of human decency in this building. I knew that the people involved occupied positions of authority. I knew that a man who had done nothing wrong was at risk because of what he'd done in front of me." She kept her voice even. This was the place where the impulse to soften was strongest, and she refused it. "I chose not to act publicly. I told myself it was strategic, that going public in my first week would destabilize the organization, provoke the board, create a media situation I wasn't equipped to manage. All of those things were true, but they were also convenient, and I knew they were convenient, and I chose them anyway." She paused. "I let the language of leadership cover for what was, at its core, a failure of courage. I protected my position. I protected my image. And in doing so, I left a man exposed to exactly the kind of retaliation I should have stopped." She looked toward the back wall. Marcus had not moved. "I am not standing here because I think a public confession cleans the slate," she said. "It doesn't. What happened to Marcus over the last 3 weeks happened on my watch, in part because of a choice I made. I will carry that. What I can do now is be clear about the consequences." She was. Greg Dalton and 2 supervisors who had participated in the retaliation were placed on immediate administrative leave pending a formal review. Victoria named the conduct plainly, described its mechanism, and stated that the outcome of the review was not expected to result in their return. She did not call it a restructuring. She did not call it a transition. She said that people who used institutional power to punish someone for basic human decency had no place in any organization she intended to lead. She said it without hedging, without the passive constructions that leadership communications so often defaulted to when real accountability was too uncomfortable to state directly. There was no, "We have decided to part ways." There was no, "As we continue to evolve our culture." She said what had happened and said what would follow from it, and she let the clarity of that stand in the room without softening. Patrick, the security guard, was placed on a formal conduct review. Victoria was measured in how she addressed his case. His actions that morning had been real, but the culture that shaped them ran deeper than one man at a door. The review, she said, would determine appropriate next steps. It was not a dismissal. It was not an erasure. It was accountability with room for something other than punishment at the end. The performance improvement plan filed against Marcus was voided on the record, in front of his co-workers and theirs. Victoria said plainly that his conduct on the morning of her arrival represented exactly the values the company claimed to hold, and that his employment was not only secure, but would be reviewed formally. Compensation, role classification, scope of responsibility, with a 30-day deadline and direct oversight from her office. She then announced 3 structural changes effective within 60 days. An anonymous reporting channel managed by an external firm, a revised performance documentation process requiring multi-party sign-off on any disciplinary action, and a quarterly culture audit conducted by staff at every level, with results reported directly to the board. "I said at my introduction that I looked forward to learning from each of you," she said, stepping back from the front of the stage. "I meant that. I already have. It just looked different than I expected." She walked off. The atrium didn't erupt. There was no dramatic outburst, no collective catharsis. What happened was more like a held breath being slowly released. A room full of people recalibrating quietly the distance between what they had been told this place was and what they had just watched happen inside it. Victoria spent the next 4 hours managing the immediate fallout. There was fallout. She had known there would be. 2 board members called before noon. A vice president sent a carefully worded message expressing concern about optics. A reporter from a business publication had already filed a request for comment. She handled all of it. What she was not entirely prepared for was the knock on her office door at just past 1 in the afternoon. She looked up. Marcus was standing in the doorway, still in his work shirt. He didn't come in. He stood at the threshold, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "You didn't have to use my name," he said. "In front of everyone."
"Yes, I did," she said.
He was quiet for a moment. "My son is going to think I'm famous." She almost smiled. "You should let him." He looked at her, the kind of look that holds more than the person giving it is going to put into words, and then he nodded once. "Thank you," he said. He left. 6 weeks later, the external reporting channel went live. The performance documentation revision was implemented 2 days ahead of schedule. When applications opened for the first quarterly culture audit panel, 3 staff members submitted their names, none of them in management. One of them was Brianna Walsh, the HR associate who had hesitated at the elevator on the morning everything began. Victoria read her application twice. She approved all 3 without modification. She also approved the reclassification of Marcus's role, effective the 1st of the following month, a meaningful adjustment to his base compensation and a formal recognition of the responsibilities he had been carrying without corresponding title or pay. She signed the paperwork herself. She did not make an announcement about it. On a Thursday in early November, Marcus Reed parked his maintenance cart in the corridor on the east side of the lobby and walked to the break room on the ground floor to get his lunch. He had started eating there again, at the table near the window, where the light came in at an angle in the afternoon, and the noise from the street was just audible enough to feel like company. The lobby, when he passed through it, looked the same as it always had. Polished stone, the digital display cycling through the company's values, receptionists at their stations. A man he recognized from the loading dock crew lifted his chin in greeting as Marcus passed. A woman from the 3rd floor administrative team, someone he'd said maybe 30 words to in 2 years, looked up from her phone and said good morning. He returned both without breaking stride. In the break room, he unwrapped the sandwich he'd made before leaving the apartment and set it on the table. He reached into the breast pocket of his work shirt and carefully unfolded the piece of paper he'd been carrying since the morning all of this started. Soft at the creases now, the green crayon faded from weeks of being pressed against the warmth of his chest, but the figures still clear, the house or hill still standing, the letters at the bottom still unmistakably his son's. U.S. He smoothed it flat against the table. He sat in the afternoon light and ate his lunch. The real test of any organization, of any person in a position of power, isn't what they do when everyone is watching. It's what they allow when they think the cost of doing right is too high. Victoria Hale almost failed that test. What stopped her wasn't a policy or a board meeting or a public relations concern. It was a man with no leverage and nothing left to lose, who walked into her office not to beg, but to hold up a mirror. Leadership is not about protecting the image of an institution. It's about being willing to let the truth be seen, even when you're part of what needs to change. If that's the kind of story that means something to you, subscribe to the channel. Every week we bring you a story about real human courage. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't make the news. The kind that happens in lobbies and break rooms and ordinary moments when someone decides to be decent for no reason other than that it's right. Hit the subscribe button, leave a comment, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. We'll see you in the next one.